Hi, I'm Eric, also known as Trekkie V47, from the Ranger Command Power Hour and the Starfleet Escape podcast. You're listening to another great Four-Eyed Radio product. For more shows, check out foureyedradio.com. It's morphin' time!
Hey there, Eric here from Socially Awkward Studios, and this Four-Eyed Radio presentation is being proudly brought to you by Raven Designs, illustration and design that fit your personality. For samples and inquiries, visit ravencruise.com.
Bond. James Bond. Shaken, not stirred.
Utter one more syllable and I'll have you killed.
I thought Christmas only comes once a year.
For your eyes only, darling.
I never joke about my work, 007.
For England, James?
Come in, Univex. James Bond here.
Am I going to have a problem with you, Bond?
Allow me to introduce myself.
You're that secret agent! That English secret agent from England!
No, you're cleverer than you look.
Still better than looking cleverer than you are.
My God, what's Bond doing?
I think he's attempting re-entry, sir.
007 reporting for duty.
Hello, the name's Berkeley, Ziggy Berkeley from Cinema on the Rocks, and with me is Eric Dewey from Socially Awkward Studios, and you are listening to Her Majesty's Secret Podcast, only on the Four-Eyed Radio Network. Yes, this is the show where we discuss Bondage, James Bondage. Yes, all things James Bond 007. And after a brief unplanned hiatus, we are back, and we're going to be discussing 3 novels written by Ian Fleming from the middle portion of his career. And those would be From Russia with Love, Dr. No, and yes, this episode features Pussy Galore. Yes, we're going to be talking about Goldfinger.
Oh, yes. From Russia with Love, Dr. No, and Goldfinger are the 3 we're going to talk about today. Good books. I actually really enjoyed all 3 of these, so I'm going to enjoy talking about them.
This is going to prove to be an interesting discussion, I think, because I'm a variant opinion on these books. Now, but hey, that's why we have 2 hosts. We've said this before. No, but as noted, this is from the middle of Ian Fleming's career. These are books number 5, 6, and 007. And they were, of course, published in a completely different order from which they were filmed. Not that there's much in the way of a continuity issue here for that. So that it's not like the case of with the Spectre books where you had the last one following the second one and it just messed things up when they translated it onto film and they just gave up.
Yeah.
It's not like that. So you don't have those kinds of issues. It's just something to note.
Right. Yeah, these ones aren't so much a trilogy as the ones with the Spectre series really should be treated as kind of one large storyline. Whereas these ones can really be treated as independent books. Yes, they do reference back, of course, but not so much so that if you just picked up Goldfinger and wanted to read it, that you'd be like, I don't know what's going on here unless I've read From Russia with Love and Dr. No. It's not like that. You can pick up any one of these books and read them. I would recommend reading them in order if you're going to read all 3, but that's just because I would almost always recommend reading books in the order that they were written, at least in the order the storylines take place, just because it just seems right.
It does, though. There are some authors who do that, who kind of mess you up that way, because you have Asimov in the Foundation series where the first book is not the one that takes place first, because he had all the prequels that he decided to write in the early 80s and then the sequels afterwards. But all good books, by the way. I do recommend Asimov's Foundation series. Personally, I think that they read best in order in which they take place, not in the order in which they were written, but they can be read in any order. So, little side tangent there. Go read some Asimov. Great writer.
Absolutely. I fully, wholeheartedly concur on that one. Definitely an Asimov fan.
And as far as the Fleming books here go, there is a little bit of continuity. What Fleming tends to like to do is sometime in the first 2 or 3 chapters, he will often mention something that happened at the end of the previous book, usually basically why Bond is not with the girl that he ended up with in the last book. But otherwise, they're all standalone books. And what we're going to start with is the novel that really is the reason that we're here. Because this is the novel that got Ian Fleming's Bond books popular on a world stage and specifically on a North American stage to the point where they were so popular that Fleming could finally achieve his dream and get his movie deal done with Eon. And that would be From Russia with Love. And the reason that this is the book that caused everything to go right is once upon a time there was a very famous American intellectual who was something of an intellectual rock star. And he was asked what his 10 favorite books were. 9 of them were socio-political economic tracts, and one of them was From Russia with Love. That person was John F. Kennedy.
Hey, I like that guy. So it really did kind of spark the popularity when people were like, oh, well, this guy's, smart and stuff, so I guess if I like the books he likes, that makes me smart and stuff too, right?
Yeah, or, oh, he's so dreamy, or whatever it is. But, it's not like they weren't popular before, but this is what really propelled it and made things able to go along. And in an unfortunate irony, as we mentioned when we were discussing the movie of From Russia with Love was the last movie that John F. Kennedy actually saw in life. He had a private screening at the White House just a few days before he was assassinated. So,
ouch.
How's that for the circle of life? And what's very interesting about that is From Russia with Love is an expression of Ian Fleming wondering if he's had enough. Because, by the way, folks, if you haven't heard our shows before, we spoil everything. So,
spoiler alert, sorry. Yeah.
There's going to be a huge spoiler coming up in about the next 30 seconds, like the ending.
Yes.
But for those who are familiar with the Sherlock Holmes stories written by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle eventually got sick of Sherlock Holmes. In fact, he started to literally hate the guy. And so he thought that, okay, I'm done. I'm going to kill him off. And so he wrote a story called The Final Problem, and this made its way into the movie Sherlock Holmes: A Game of Shadows, because it was a showdown with Moriarty, and he decided the only way to defeat Moriarty was that he had to kill him, but in order to kill him, he had to die at the same time, because he basically threw him over a waterfall. And that was it. Sherlock Holmes, at the end of that story, was considered dead. Well, From Russia with Love does not end the same way that the movie does.
No, not exactly. Quite a bit different, I would say, actually.
Because we do end up in the hotel room where him and Tatiana are concluding their business, and you have Rosa Klebb coming in disguised as a hotel staff member, and she whips out the dagger shoot, except in the book, she stabs Bond with the poisoned dagger shoot, and Bond succumbs to the poison. And the way the book ends is he's fading out of consciousness, and it looks like he's going to be dead.
Yeah, if you didn't know there was another book or many other books after this, if you were reading this when it first came out, and you would have no idea. You'd literally be like, holy crap, he's dead. WTF, mate? What's going on? Because, they don't leave a whole lot of wiggle room there. They point out that this is some serious poison. It's almost impossible to be cured from, and, he got stabbed with it. And he's not getting any help anytime real soon either. So it's pretty tense if you're a fan of the character.
Yeah, and Fleming was basically getting frustrated, and one thing that is a known fact about his real life is he was depressive, and he was getting frustrated. He wanted to sell this character, and he was getting nowhere, and he felt he was kind of running out of ideas, and then so he thought, well, maybe I should just kill him off. And then, of course, there was the protest from fans, and then there was the prospect of making more money, and realistically, Fleming was in this for the money, and so, let's face it, most people are once they hit success.
Yes.
You can say, I'm just in it for my art and nothing else, and that's fine as long as you're not actually making money. The moment you start making money, it turns out that you really like this stuff. But so Fleming, of course, ended up going on, and he explains it rather artfully. And we're going to give away a little bit of the next book because they explain how James Bond got out of it. Turns out that the poison in the dagger shoot was fugu poisoning, which for anyone who's watched enough Travel Channel or is a fan of Japanese items and culture and trivia and so on, that is the blowfish, which if you do not prepare it properly and remove a certain organ just right, you will poison the meat and you'll die. It's a delicacy in Japan. You have to be very specifically licensed in order to prepare it, even the dog laments, and you have to sign a waiver before you order this stuff.
Yeah.
So it's nasty poison, and it takes you out pretty quick. But the way that they describe how James Bond survived is he ended up getting CPR right away, and it turns out that the doctor who showed up happened to have seen a case of fugu poisoning from a Japanese restaurant in France just recently and knew how to deal with it.
So, ooh, this is my expertise. I know how to do this.
Aren't we lucky?
Now, from what I understand also, and this is only from third-hand knowledge because, quite frankly, I like food, and I'm not into food that is going to possibly kill me. I don't like to... The only waiver I'll sign before eating some food is like if I'm going to try the suicide wings at some, like bar, and that's just because it's fun. I know it's not going to kill me. I might wish I was dead the next day, but it's not actually going to kill me. But from what I understand, the fish doesn't even taste that good. It's just a matter of the thrill of being in a potentially deadly situation is what makes it the delicacy. From what I understand, it's actually a fairly flavorless fish in and of itself.
That is what I understand from people I've known who have actually eaten the stuff.
Yeah.
So from secondhand knowledge, because I knew the person who ate it, I didn't eat it myself. That I've heard the same thing.
Yeah.
And I notice it's not necessarily fear of death, but something similar with a lot of so-called delicacies. It's not the fact that they taste good. It's the fact that they are either rare or expensive.
Mm-hmm.
That is it. I mean, it's just like Roman Empire. They had things... Emperors tried to come up with the weirdest shit to bring over to their banquets. Giraffe tongue and things like that. And things that no person could possibly think were edible. But because they were rare, that's what made them valuable.
Yep.
And to me, that only goes so far. I mean, I enjoy shiitake mushrooms. That's fine. I mean, and they're not exactly rare, but they are rare. They are rarer, which makes them more expensive. And I'm okay with that. But if you tell me, well, there's this super duper truffle from hell that you can only go get by traveling down past Cerberus, the three-headed dog, and it costs $50,000 a bite. Yeah, screw that.
Yeah, I'll pass on that as well. I'll be like, could I just get skip that. I'll just take a large pepperoni, please. Thanks. I'm like, mushrooms are something I throw in my salad or on my pizza. I'm not paying $50,000 for a truffle or mushroom-like thing. And they use so little of it, too. Like, I understand, okay, it's rare, right? Okay, it's hard to find. You have to train these pigs to find the things, and you have to train them really well because they have to find them, but then you have to get them before they actually eat them. Otherwise, they eat thousands of dollars worth of truffles in one gulp because that's the reason they find them is because they like them. But, yeah, I've never really been big on that. I've had some foods. I find that the one thing that I will pay more for and usually get a better product for your money is booze. The more you pay for booze, the more likely you are to get a very good drink.
I will put a caveat on that. I think that's true up until you reach the point of about $100, $125.
Mm-hmm.
Once you get above that, because I have like one thing that I try to mention on my website, Cinema on the Rocks. It's the reason that I don't just review quote unquote good movies. Is I don't think that anything exists in a vacuum. I think that in order to appreciate what's good, you also have to know what bad is like. It's like you aren't going to understand fully why the Hofbrau Oktoberfest is awesome unless you also know that the Milwaukee's Beast is crap, and you can tell the difference between the two by having tasted them. And same with the Mad Dog 2020 versus the Fine Chianti. On the other hand, you'll also discover that there are some reasonably priced things that taste far better than some of the expensive stuff. Mm-hmm. Like, for example, I've had Dom Pérignon several times. In fact, I have even had the infamous James Bond Dom Pérignon 53. I did not pay for it. I don't want to know how much it was. It was at one of those occasions where you don't see the bill unless you're the one who pays. I'm glad I didn't see the bill.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you, it's not that great. I mean, a $25 bottle of German Sekt, which is German sparkling wine, they just can't call it champagne for legal reasons, was just as good, if not a little bit better tasting to me. I mean, like, yeah, $75 Veuve Clicquot was pretty good. I've had a champagne that should go for about $100-125 called, and yes, it's made by this family, Chateau de Marquis de Sade, and that was very good. But I think that's about the pinnacle. Anything above that starts getting,
It hurt a bit, but it hurts so good.
Yeah, that's another one that I didn't pay full boat for. I paid $50 for the bottle. What happened was I was going to the store looking for a champagne for New Year's, and I asked the person behind the counter, do you have anything you recommend? And I gave her my budget, and she said, well, as it so happens, we had somebody who ordered this stuff for $150. They had to put down a $100 deposit, and they didn't show up to pick it up. So if you want it, you just have to pay the rest of the bill. Like, what is it? Marquis de Sade? Done. Just novelty. That was my Millennium Champagne, by the way, so very delicious. But anyway, so back on track a little bit.
A little bit, yeah.
So,
but the point to the story is, in some cases you do get what you pay for, but I agree, only up to a certain point. There is a cutoff to where you are no longer paying for the product, you are paying for either the thrill or the rarity or the name that's on it as opposed to the actual product itself. I used to work for Foot Locker. You see that all the time with shoes. The $50 running shoes or $50 basketball shoes with no name attached to them are exactly the same shoe as the $150 Jordans. They just don't have the word Jordan on them. So,
yeah, and I don't think it's totally off topic because, one, it did stem from how James Bond was poisoned with dagger shoe, but it's also speaking to the James Bond lifestyle.
Exactly, yes. You do see him opt for these very fine things quite often. But a lot of times, if you research a lot of the things that I've looked into, several of the things he's asked for specifically, and it gets very good reviews from people who have actually tasted it as well. So I think he's one of those that knows his stuff. When it comes to you get what you pay for only up to that certain point, I don't think he's, with the exception maybe of that Dom Pérignon, he's pretty much picking the good stuff that's actually good, not just the expensive stuff.
And I think it also speaks to his notion of he just doesn't know if he's going to be alive tomorrow. And he always lives in the moment. And this is something we've discussed both in the Ian Fleming version of the character and the movie version. It's one of the things that is kept consistent is James Bond doesn't collect stuff. He very much lives in the moment. And so anything that he gets...
He's a consumer, not a collector.
Yeah, he just figures because of his lifestyle as a secret agent who gets shot at all the time, he just might as well live life to the fullest right now.
Exactly.
And so it makes sense. Now, on the other hand, in the movies, he's a little more discriminating than he is in the books. Like our discussion from last time we discussed the book's Old Granddad. And then as we go on in these books, again, he has some wildly cheap tastes in liquor. And that's something that I'm noticing in these books is that he never really stuck to any one thing. It's only in the movies that we have the signature medium dry vodka martini shaken not stirred, where they stuck with the Vesper. Even without having the story from which the Vesper came, that's what they stuck with.
Right.
So
well, I think with the movies, they were really probably going for that. They needed something iconic. They needed a soundbite to put in the trailers, to put on the posters, to put on in the ads and whatnot. And so I think that's one of the things they kind of latched onto was the James Bond, and the shaken, not stirred. I think that for the movies, you need that soundbite. Books, you don't really need that. You don't need a soundbite for a book. So it makes more sense for it to be a little bit more varied in the books, I think, than in the movies. The movie world tends to be for people with shorter attention spans, and so you need something tying everything together to remind you that this is all part of the same franchise.
And then we also have to remember, too, that most of these books were written in the 50s. And so even just between the 50s and the 60s, the mindset of marketing is a different thing. Because really the idea of marketing in a modern sense kind of takes off in the 60s. I mean, we have definite exclusivity marketing before that. Amana presents this, that, and the next thing. But it's just the mentality behind it's different. So I think that there's also that. But yeah, they're different media. So it's just something to keep in mind as we explore these things.
Yeah, absolutely.
But getting back to the book, this is From Russia with Love is one of my favorites of the Ian Fleming James Bond novels. And what's interesting about that, and in some ways it follows a similar tack to some other ones that I like. It doesn't really get into the Bond versus villain story for quite a while. In fact, for the first third of the book, James Bond doesn't even show up. He's not there. And I like that. I like this change in perspective. It's not an alien change in perspective, because what it is, it's similar to how it was done in the movie. Except in the movie, you have it only done for James Bond doesn't show up for the first 20 minutes. Whereas here, it's a much longer period. And what you start with is Red Grant. Mm-hmm. And you go through a much longer progression of who he is, what kind of person he is.
He's a were-killer. Oh.
His real background.
Yeah.
So
really
he's
makes
not
him a
just
very interesting character. He really is kind of one of these very twisted, but yet still has his own kind of code, so to speak. Not a full-on, Dexter-ish type of thing, but, somewhat like that, where he's got this, he knows he has these urges, and he knows when he has these urges, and so he chooses to go into a line of work that allows him to play this out, basically, and hey, good for him.
And this is the 1950s, so this is before this idea really has taken public hold. He ends up being what a modern reader automatically says, oh, he's a classic serial killer. Because he has these urges to kill, and he has them, as has since become stereotypically, at the time of the full moon. Mm-hmm. And he ends up doing this as a hobby. And then because of the era in which this is written, during World War II, he basically stumbles into the ability to do this for a living as a counter-espionage agent for the Soviet Union. And it's just, I really like the depth that's gone into in developing this character. And this is the kind of character that really not many authors are exploring at this time. Basically, you have Fleming, you have Robert Bloch, the guy who wrote Psycho. So this is very close to bleeding edge in terms of characterization here, which is not something you can normally say about how Fleming writes.
Yeah, but not typically. But yeah, you're right. This one did have a lot more characterization than some of the previous novels and even some of the novels that follow. And I agree. This was one of my favorite to read through. It really, I don't think they could have gotten away with filming it exactly as it was written, because moviegoers, when you show up to a Bond movie, you need to see Bond sometime in the very beginning of the you need to see him pretty soon, and even waiting 20 minutes into a film to show the main character is going to be taxing on the average viewer, whereas in a book, people are already investing more time, I think, into the story, that you can get away with it a little bit better.
I think so too. And I think like you said, I think they were pushing it about as far as they could with the movie, though the movie comes as close to the book as I think we could possibly have allowed, in terms of not just that aspect, but just in terms of how the whole plot plays out.
Right.
Because this is actually kind of a dirty plot. Because not only do we have the whole story behind serial killer Red Grant, but then we also get into much more depth of the prelude to how Tatiana Romanova is brought into this conspiracy, and we learn more about the character of Rosa Klebb. And this is one of the points where Ian Fleming goes from, okay, we're near the bleeding edge of characterization, to, all right, I found a stereotype, and I'm just going to jump right back into it.
Well, you notice that happens more with the female characters than it does with the male characters. So
yeah, because in the movie, Rosa Klebb was portrayed as, you could tell she was supposed to be the closeted lesbian hag.
Right.
And I use that to describe the stereotype. Whereas in this book, no, she is the outright lesbian hag who basically gets to the point where she puts on a negligee and says, "Come hither, Tatiana," and Tatiana runs like hell because she knows she's about to be raped.
Like, whoa!
And Fleming goes out of his way to make Rosa Klebb as hideous as possible, because she can't just be lesbian and evil. No, that also means she has to be ugly, because that's just what we do. So
yeah, in Fleming's mindset, that's what a lesbian is some evil, ugly hag. Whereas we now know, of course, that that's not the way it works. There are ugly, evil hags of all different orientations, and there's beautiful, wonderful people of all different orientations as well. There's no one type of person that happens to be of a particular sexual orientation. It just doesn't work that way.
Yeah, and Fleming seems to only have 2 switches for that, and we'll be going into the second switch for that as we talked about another book. One of them is, if they are definitely born to it, then they're the evil hag. And then the other one, like I said, we'll get to. But so you have that characterization. But I also really like, in this book, you have the machinations of how Smersh works. And this is one place where Fleming can really excel, because the names he uses and the descriptions he gives of the inner meeting of the higher-ups of the Soviet military intelligence complex, he's describing that from personal experience as a former British intelligence officer. So as someone who had access to this information, who knows how this really works, And except for the few characters he made up, Rosa Klebb, Red Grant, Tatiana Romanova, the names he's using of these generals and other officials, they're real. And he's describing to the best of British intelligence knowledge what this meeting would really look like and how the plotting would go. And I just found that fascinating.
Yeah, definitely a bright point in the storyline, and like we said, this was a good one to read to begin with. So I definitely agree. That was definitely a very interesting point and well written, especially when you compare and contrast to the way he writes the female characters sometimes. You can kind of forget that he actually was a really good author when he stuck to his wheelhouse, but when you try to go outside of it, which, female characterizations, for example, it leaves a little to be desired. But other than that, good stuff.
Yeah, and you also have, in the description of Tatiana, I was actually surprised. I mean, yeah, we have it so that she's going to turn to someone who ends up helping Bond, so we can't make her totally negative. But he actually humanizes her. I mean, he doesn't make her into this wonderful female character. She's still kind of a doormat to whatever happens around her. Like, when we first meet her, she's resigned to the fact that while she's very, very good at her job, she knows that the only way she'll ever advance is if she ends up finally agreeing to marry a male agent above her, at which point then she will be suborned to that male agent the rest of her life. And then when she ends up getting into this mission and falling in with Bond, again, it's just kind of like, okay, this is what makes the most sense. I'm not really making the decision, just man, think for me. And even though she's good at her job, but at the same time, while he can't allow her to have her own brain and her own human compass, he still makes her a sympathetic character. And she's probably one of the most normal, real women that Fleming's ever written that I can think of. I mean, not exactly the paragon of feminism by any chance, but just in terms of she's still a real person. There are still plenty of people like this, and it doesn't sound like a man speaking out of this female character when we see her talking. So at least there's some reality and also some sympathy we can give to the character of Tatiana.
Yeah, you definitely, you wonder if maybe he did get either some help in doing the characterization for her, or if he was basing that on somebody he knew. And so you did get a little bit better characterization from her than you did with any of his other female characters, I think, in almost any of the books. And so you got to wonder if there was some influence there, either by somebody helping him directly or just personal knowledge, if that was based loosely or wholly on somebody that he knew.
Yeah, in either way, interesting character until she has to think for herself, but still well done character. So basically what we have is this whole opening section of the book that actually goes on for a little more than a third of its real page count, but it's the first act of the book, where Bond doesn't even exist. And even if you're coming in specifically because I want to read a Bond book, you don't mind, because most of this is in Fleming's wheelhouse. And it's just so well done. And the chance to see what his major bad guys are like, really get to see it from what in the 80s might have been called an aggressor squad perspective, is just fascinating. Though I also find it interesting that Fleming doesn't really like to use the term Soviet or Russian. He always calls it Redland. You notice that?
Those darn Ruskies. Yeah, but that was okay back then, because they were still the enemy, and they were still the evil, the great evil red people over there, and so you get away with it. You notice they changed that quite a bit in the movies. It's always either a completely independent organization or a fringe Soviet organization, or somebody, it's never the actual Soviet Union. So, but in the books, he could definitely get away with it because that was the time.
And that I can see. I just find it interesting that when he's outside of talking from the Soviet perspective, so basically whenever Bond or M or anyone from the English side or the American side are talking about the Soviets, they never say Soviet. They say Smersh or they say Redland. It's kind of like in the Captain America movies. You never saw a swastika, even though they're fighting in Nazi Germany. They would not show a swastika. It's like he went out of his way, and it's just, there's no offensive reason why he should or shouldn't. It just strikes me as an odd quirk of his writing.
Yeah, it is kind of odd. I never really, honestly, it didn't jump out at me as much. Going back and thinking about it, yeah, I see what you're saying, but it didn't jump out at me at the time. And maybe that's because it's not the political situation right now that we're dealing with, so it doesn't, jump out at me that way. Whereas if I was reading it in that time, which I wasn't even alive then, but if I were and I was reading it then, I'm wondering if I may have noticed it more. If I may have been like, hey, wait a minute, how come he doesn't say this? So it's interesting, but I'm not sure that I understand why.
Yeah. But now, moving on, I also found it sad interesting. It's not just with Rosa Klebb that Ian Fleming decides to note his particular distaste for homosexuality. There's also a section in there where Bond is having a discussion with someone in intelligence, and they're talking about possibility of, staffing, changing the makeup of the agency, and they need more intellectuals. And, of course, automatically the thought is, well, intellectual equals homosexual. So you suggest, quote, this starting the quote here, so you suggest we should staff the organization with long-haired perverts. That's quite an original notion. I thought we all agreed that homosexuals were the worst security risk there is.
I had forgotten about that.
Now,
yeah, wow.
And the thing is,
50s.
Let's be honest here. Why was homosexuality such a security risk? It's because you had to hide it. The moment your society says this is no big deal, it's not a security risk. It's just it's no more of a security risk than having a mistress if you don't want your wife to find out. It's just a secret. That's what makes the security risk. It's not the orientation itself. So it's just, and Bond actually comes out, and all intellectuals aren't homosexual, and many of them are bald. I'm just saying. So it's that comes in there. It's just interesting.
Yeah, it's one of those things that you're exactly right. You're taking an agency essentially that is. You have to be fully devoted. You have to be fully committed to the agency in order to really do it. And yes, they do understand that if you have to hide a part of yourself, especially a major part of yourself like that, that means you are essentially lying all the time. And so I can understand why that would be a security risk. But the fact of the matter is they cultivated an environment that required it by being hostile to homosexuals. I mean, it's one of those things. They created that security risk themselves. They created that need. If it was just a matter of if it just straight up didn't matter, which is thankfully where we're headed these days, where it almost doesn't matter. Unfortunately, there are still a lot of people for whom it does matter very much, and I'm still not quite sure why. I still haven't quite wrapped my brain around why it matters so much to some people, but we're moving towards a place where it doesn't matter anymore. And hopefully within the next 5, 10, 15, maybe 20 years, we'll actually reach a point where it just straight up doesn't matter. But until we get there, you do still have that kind of stigma hanging over it where, well, if you had to hide this, what else could you be hiding?
And so it's another one of those things, like all of the Negroism in Live and Let Die. It jumps out as I'm reading this, and it's a matter of modern perspective, and that's all it is. And that's something to again, as we always mention, make note of as you're reading these books. If you are so entrenched in modern way of thinking, and I'm not saying that's a bad thing. This is just a know thyself. If you're so entrenched that you can't read this stuff without it just driving you insane and making you want to throw things, don't read this. But if you remember the time in which it was written and the fact that the man who wrote it was something of a cultural Neanderthal in terms of his approaches to other human beings, not necessarily in terms of refinement or worldliness, but just in terms of his approach to other human beings, then you're okay in the game, and there you go. Like another thing, as we're talking to Karen Bay, once Bond gets into Turkey, Karen Bay is mentioning how the ideal way of marrying a woman is basically going and raping her and then saying, so you want to get married? What? No. But that's basically how it goes in the book.
Exactly. Yeah, it's interesting. It is an interesting dynamic to kind of. It's almost like reading into the past. You're looking at a totally different mindset that is completely out of whack with what we consider normal today. But at the time, it was only slightly wacky. I'm not going to say it was completely normal, because even in the 50s and leading into the 60s, we were starting to head down that path of more equality for more groups of people. So it wasn't completely normal, thankfully, but it still was much more normal than it is definitely today, or even 10, 15 years ago.
So one thing that I also found interesting in From Russia with Love is when Bond is flying down to Turkey, he's noting that in his own mind that there are 13 people on the plane, which would drive his personal secretary, who's very superstitious, nuts. But then they go through turbulence, and we end up kind of thinking that Bond is close to peeing himself. In terms of he's really rattled by this, and finally he's just like, well, it's in fate's hands now if I go down. Oh, well. But he gets nervous. I mean, he's actually scared during this flight.
And you know what?
That surprised me.
I'm actually okay with it, because I think it shows a side of the Bond persona that you don't get to see very often, and that's the fact that he has to be in control. You do see it in quite a lot of other places, but you don't see very many situations where he's not in control. And that is a situation where he can't control. If that plane crashes, he has no power whatsoever if something did happen. And so that makes him, he's realizing all of a sudden that his fate is completely in somebody else's hand. There's not a dang thing he could do about it. And so I'm okay with that. I think it kind of lends to that what do you want to say, obsessive personality, or that type of control freak personality that he's got going on, which obviously he has to have in his line of work, but you kind of get a glimpse as to what could happen in situations where he really doesn't have any control.
Yeah, I think it works. It's not something that as a regular Bond fan you'd necessarily expect to see until it happened.
At least he didn't pull Kevin Smith and give him a bladder spasm. That would have been bad.
Yeah, that would have been awful. I don't think I could. Speaking of awful, that's how he describes all Turkish food as we go on. Bond feels like by awful, I mean the spelling O-F-F-A-L, so even worse than awful.
It's awful.
Awful, of course, being cast off and that kind of thing. And his liquor in this movie in this book is raki, which is Turkish spirit, which he compares to ouzo, which he doesn't particularly like either.
That's because anything that's anise-based should be banished from everything ever. That's just a horrible... Who tasted anise and said, I think I need to make liquor and candy out of this. This is horrible. I think I should make everybody drink as much of this as possible.
Yes, but then you're also breaking off his martinis and so on and so forth.
I'm not a big fan of anise flavoring in anything. I don't like black licorice. I skip the black jelly beans if I get a bag of jelly beans. What are is it Good and Plenty's that are the little licorice bits coated in candy?
Yeah, I think so.
I will suck all the candy off of those and then spit out the licorice bit. I don't drink Jägermeister. I always buy the red NyQuil, not the green NyQuil. I mean, gross.
I will take it in very specific styles and quantities. I'm not that big a black licorice fan. I think actually that Sambuca is one of the most disgusting liquors ever, though quarter shot of black Sambuca inside of a quad espresso does work. I do drink absinthe. That particular flavor works okay. Of course, anise is only part.
Yeah, I've never actually had absinthe, so
that's only part of the flavoring. Really, if you're getting decent absinthe, the primary essence in it is Grand Wormwood, but there's also mix of many other things. It's an acquired taste, and it's one that I take in measured doses.
Do you do the sugar cube thing and all that? That's what I always see is the little
sugar cube and cold water.
There you go. That's what I always see in the movies and such. Because, like I said, I've never had it, so I'm like, eh.
Yeah, and that's actually a really good idea to do that, because if you drink absinthe straight, you will be talking to the Green Fairy, and you will be talking to her soon. Of course, she may also be telling you to go F off, in which case you're in for a world of hurt. So Bond's taste in liquor is... Well, it's not really his taste, it's what he's forced to do, and he mixes vodka with the water so he doesn't feel like he has to have Montezuma's revenge in Turkey. He doesn't seem to particularly enjoy the food very much, so once he's there, it's not really high living for him, though He does get to go on the Orient Express. Hooray.
Makes me wonder if Fleming himself had visited Turkey and that was what his takeaway was, that, beautiful place, awful food.
And as Karen Bay is describing his country, that's where I kind of think that you're right, because even Karen Bay, as a half-Turk who lives in Turkey himself, is describing his country. He hates the food. He doesn't particularly like a lot of things about it, and yet he won't leave it. So it's almost like the doth protest too much type thing. But we also have the larger-than-life Karen Bay. I do like the movie portrayal of him better, just in terms of I think that the actor really made it for a more friendly, likable persona. But he's still a very interesting character in this book. I rather like that. And he also makes a very interesting observation of how he wants to die, because his philosophy of life is you should have sex every day, because, that's living. And he's not afraid of getting, as he terms it, the crab, with a capital TC. And he's like, if he ends up dying of the crab, he will consider himself having lived a full life. So that's the first person I've heard of who wants to die of the crabs. I mean, I've heard of people say they want to die having a heart attack at orgasm, something like that, but dying of the crabs.
Being squeezed to death by Xenia on a top's thighs. I could see that. The crab, definitely no. I'm seeing it right now. Oh. Anyways, yeah, definitely. At least he picked one that's easily treatable, as opposed to being like, oh man, if I get herpes, man, that would just be the cat's meow right there. That'd be the bee's knees if I could just get me a good raging case of herpes. No, at least he was going for something a little bit, treatable, I guess. You have to get that special shampoo and the tiny comb, right? Get rid of that. But whatever, to each their own, I guess.
But once Bond and Karen Bay hook up in Turkey, and we're going through the cultural tour of Turkey, and really, even though this has one of the most involved, intelligence-based plots, it also ends up seeming like that's a side trip. Because in this, I found the greatest joy of the book was in the planning stage, the parts where Smersh was discussing how they were going to do everything. Whereas in terms of once we started executing it, I picked up more on the details of what was happening around, like the descriptions of the food and so on and so forth, as opposed to the actual machinations of how the plot was going. That just seemed secondary. And really, Ian Fleming appears to have put it in cruise control, too, as far as how I read it. Was that your take as well?
Yeah, I think so. It was kind of, like you said, a little bit glossed over, even though it was kind of a big point. So I could get with that. But then I think they made up for it with the fun aboard the Orient Express. So.
Yeah. And, of course, the fun aboard the Orient Express was fun. I rather like how we start with 3 bad guys, and they cleverly figure out how to get 2 of them off via subterfuge. Thought that worked out very well. And then, of course, the duel between Grant and Bond, when it comes to it, plays out nicely. Very quick, though, I thought. It felt like it ended too soon, but on the other hand, I don't see how it couldn't have. Because, okay, you're in a fist fight, and eventually it's got to end quickly. Mm-hmm. We're not doing a WWE wrestling match. So realistically, it has to end quickly. But It just, I suppose it's after the buildup of having a villain who is finally the equal of Bond in many ways, and in some ways perhaps even a little bit better, it just seems like it happened too fast. I mean, there's no way to avoid it. I can't think of a single way to have avoided it.
Yeah, it's one of those things that the only thing that you could possibly say is that maybe you wanted to be able to see Grant come back at a later date, and unfortunately, the way that they work that, it doesn't, spoiler alert, Grant's not coming back.
But I also can't see how it would be possible to have gotten away with it and made it make sense either.
Yeah, you would have had to change the character, and then it wouldn't have been something that we wanted. Grant was such a great character, but because of the way his character is portrayed, you're right, it couldn't have been any longer, and it couldn't, I mean, really the only thing you could do to make that scene longer is, give Grant a big monologue, and that would ruin the character, because he's not a monologuer. He's not that kind of character. So he's not going to...
He gives about the longest monologue you can possibly expect out of him.
Yeah. Which was not long at all. So, it works out. But, that's the only way I could think of that you could force the scene to be longer, and it would ruin the character if you did that. So, while we're sad to see such a great character go so quickly, at least it was high action and a good amount of suspense leading up to that point. So I think it played out well. It's just one of those things that it was so well played out, as a matter of fact, that you wish there could have been a way to make it longer.
Yeah. And overall, again, very good book, really wonderful, deep thinking book, because again, we get into the planning of everything. It's the part that you usually don't see, because usually you start with the execution and then the resolution, whereas this book flip-flops it, and you see more of the planning than you see of the execution in terms of how much attention is really devoted to the meat and bones of it. So I think that for what Fleming had considered possibly making it Bond's swan song, he did such a good job as to make sure that couldn't happen. So I like to think that in the back of his mind he was saying, I don't really want to kill him, even though I hate him now. So... But overall, I do recommend the book. I recommend it as one of the best of the series, actually.
I would definitely agree with that. This was one of the ones that was the most fun to read. Like we said, you got that great characterization going on with Grant. You get some good characterization with Tatiana, and you get to see more of Bond. He doesn't come until later in the book, but you really get to see more. I think for me, the only weak point was the fact that they were trying to make it the villain's plot is not just to kill Bond, but he wants to somehow turn it into a grand sex scandal that will rock the world. I'm like, so you're taking a secret agent who's known for sleeping with anything with a pulse, and you're going to make a scandal out of him sleeping with someone? I don't
see that I don't.
Reasoning.
I do understand the reasoning there, because Bond is not a public figure. He's not someone who's known outside of in the intelligence community. Yeah, everybody knows he sleeps around with everybody. But outside of the intelligence community, he's not known at all. And just think about it from a modern perspective. Okay, we find out that there is a spy scandal where you have somebody who's about to double-cross their country and then ends up sleeping with a foreign intelligence agent, and then there's blackmail and lurid sex video. Are you kidding? The news would be all over that shit for months. You'd never stop hearing it. It wouldn't matter if you didn't know who those people were before. It would never end. And I think that's the situation they were looking for. So I don't have a problem with that at all. I think that's realistic.
I don't know. Well, it's one of those things that I could definitely see it being in the news, but I could see it being one of the many things in the news that I pay absolutely no attention to whatsoever. So maybe it's just my personal... well, yeah, pretty much. Hey, I'll turn on the news and be like, okay, they're trying to scare me. Don't give a crap about what Kardashians are doing. Trying to scare me. Okay. What's in your fridge that will kill you instantly? Wait till 10 o'clock and we'll tell you. Like, but what if I want to eat between now and 10, you jerks? No, I hate the news, especially TV news. It's so biased and so geared towards just putting fear into people for no good reason, and they don't actually... they rarely actually give you any news, anything that's actually...
To our friends who are listening from Canada or Great Britain, you don't know how lucky you have it.
Oh, yeah. We're talking about the U.S. Media outlets here. It's
and I'm not saying that everywhere else is perfect either. I'm just saying that, oh, wow, huge difference.
That's why I
say this from experience.
That is why I love the internet, though. I can, if I hear about a story that does sound interesting, I can go and hit up 3 or 4 different sites that are all going to have a different perspective on it and kind of figure out where the truth probably lies somewhere in the middle of all those stories. Whereas if I just watch one news channel, which is what a lot of people do, then I'm only going to get their side of it. And that's makes me nutty. I've got some family members that post ridiculous stuff from both sides of the spectrum, not even just picking on righties or lefties here, from both sides of the spectrum that are so obviously biased. It's like, how can you not see how twisted they're taking this story? And it's crazy. But I digress. My hatred of the news media has derailed us.
There is one more thing that I do want to mention before we leave From Russia with Love, and that is the way that the book starts is it picks up with the why we don't see Bond with Tiffany Case from Diamonds Are Forever anymore. And, of course, because at the end of Diamonds Are Forever, it looked like that things were going to go very well for them. And it turns out that she ended up getting sick of his crap after a few months. But apparently they lasted a few months and were considering getting married.
That's a record.
And then the thing that struck me as odd is when M said, well, it's a good thing because mixed marriages never go well anyway. How is that a mixed marriage? I can only think of he must mean because she was American. Because, I mean, ethnically speaking, I mean, to use terms that Fleming himself might pick up, she was Aryan. I mean, she was blonde, white girl. And so it's not like even Fleming's usual, well, she was Slavic or she was an Islander or a Negro or whatever. I don't get it. I just don't. But yeah, so basically she was sick of putting up with his crap and she left.
Typical. Yeah. And I wonder why he decided to, I mean, honestly, I guess to push the story along and have him, get with Tatiana, he had to break up that relationship first, but it almost seems like unnecessary, he could have just been like, yeah, it didn't work. But instead of putting them together and being like, oh no, it almost worked and then it didn't. It's just kind of an interesting place he took it. And you wonder if that, again, it kind of almost makes me think that maybe something was going on, either with him personally, that something similar happened, or that he knew somebody that something similar happened and he needed to get it in a book just to, kind of free himself from it. I might be taking this way too seriously than it actually is. He might have just been like, whatever.
Yeah, but that's what we do here. So.
Yes. We dive deep in and start making up reasons for Fleming's actions.
So, do you have anything else to say about From Russia with Love?
No, just go read it if you haven't yet. Hopefully we didn't spoil it too much for you. Obviously, if you haven't read it yet, it was written in the 50s. I mean, come on now. It's been out there for a while. Go check it out. It's a good book. Read it.
And that brings us on to the next book in the series, which was made, of course, into the first official Eon production. And that is Dr. No, which is not as much like the movie as From Russia with Love is. We start off with, for example, Dr. No's island is based on a fortune made from shit.
Guano bowls. Collect the whole set.
Yes, it's literally made from bird droppings. And guano really is a valuable product. I mean, I'm not disputing that at all. You can make millions because it is one of the world's best fertilizers, and you have other uses for it as well. But I guess that just didn't seem glamorous enough to start off James Bond in the movies. So
yeah,
of course
I don't think the American audience especially would have been like, wait a minute, so he controls bird poo? I don't understand what's going on here. Why is this a big deal? I think people would have been thinking about it too long and would have dropped out of the storyline because of it.
Yeah. So what did you think of Dr. No? What were your impressions?
I enjoyed reading it. It was definitely not my favorite of his books so far, but I actually did enjoy the read. There were definitely some points where it was a little bit iffy, but it feels to me like with these three books especially that Fleming was kind of getting into a groove. And you definitely could tell with the transition from Russia with Love to Dr. No that it was almost kind of a comeback because he did regress a little bit. Yeah, I felt near the beginning. But then I think he got back into the swing of it, and I found it an enjoyable read.
Okay. No, I'm not saying you're wrong.
Now, I'm not saying you're wrong, but here's why you're wrong.
No, in terms of this book, I'm with you. In terms of this book, I do think he seems to have hit a comeback stride where he felt that, okay, I'm back in with this character now, and I've got the boost from other people that I need to say that I can make this into something good. I'm enjoying it again. I'm not going to carry that on to the next book. I'll tell you that. I don't think that this is a three-pronged strong suit. I don't know how group or something. In terms of how well written they are, I think that they go in order. Best is From Russia with Love. This is second. Goldfinger's last out of these three. And while I think Fleming was more confident with this book, I do think From Russia with Love was the better book. But I do agree that I think he was more confident. He definitely had a bigger groove going. And we also get a repeat character. First one really outside of the staff of British intelligence and Felix Leiter. We finally get a repeat in terms of Quarrel, which was, of course, something that they had to work in with a consistency error in the movies, because, of course, in both Dr. No the movie and Dr. No the book, Quarrel dies, and he dies the same way. Right. He's burned to a crisp by, quote-unquote, the dragon. But Live and Let Die, the movie, was made much later than Dr. No the movie, even though Live and Let Die, the book, is the introduction of the character of Quarrel. So, of course, what do we have? Quarrel Jr., who personally to me didn't live up to the name Quarrel. I really like the character of Quarrel for the Dr. No movie, and that is how I picture him when I was reading either of the books that have that character, both Live and Let Die and Dr. No, because I thought that the portrayal was so strong and well done that was one where it just translated right into the book for me.
I agree. Quarrel was a great character, and it's great in the books that because the second movie was actually a previous book, you got to see the character stay the same instead of having to be changed and diluted as they did in the movies. So it was good to see Quarrel back, and sad to see him go.
I also found it interesting where you had Ian Fleming for just a moment with the character of Quarrel, because you can tell he likes Quarrel. And even though we know Fleming is a racist, I mean, you can't argue against that. He's also very much a fan of Jamaica. I mean, he made his home there. It was called GoldenEye. And you can tell that even though, Quarrel is a superstitious Negro, and he has him speaking in this really awful pidgin, nevertheless, he can't put Quarrel, this Jamaican character whom I have a feeling probably has a basis on some locals that he must have known himself, because he puts more heart and soul into Quarrel than he does into most of his, to use his term, Negro characters. And you can tell it's like, you're a Negro, but I like you. I like Negroes, and not just because I don't want them to beat me up.
But I like jazz, so that'll get me out of anything, right? Oh.
Yeah, you can tell that Fleming is feeling kind of conflicted about this. I think this is the one time you see some kind of conflict over his prejudice, because Bond keeps making excuses in his own head. It's kind of like the song Gunga Din, where, he was pure white inside. You're trying to rationalize your racism. Well, most of them are bad except for this one. So it's something that I think comes out in the character of Quarrel, because he doesn't want Quarrel to be that black savage, quote unquote,
right? That
he's portrayed every one of them as, and now he has to backtrack.
Right.
So the backtracking is something that's kind of interesting to explore as we're reading the character.
Yeah, and I think, again, this is another thing that I would look at, and not knowing any history or having read any biographies of Ian Fleming, I would almost think that maybe this was based on a real person in his life as well. Maybe he did have, bad experiences, or what he thought were bad experiences because he didn't give it a chance with other black people, but then maybe there was this one that he was always like, hey, you know what, I like you even though, and that really challenged his own personal stereotypes, and maybe that worked its way into the book somehow.
Yeah, I would guess that he started with British Imperial stereotype, because that's where he is with everything, right, pretty much. But I agree. I think that Quarrel has to be either someone or an amalgam of people he knew in Jamaica, just because there's heart there, and there's a beating heart, and it's not the sort that Fleming normally puts into anybody. Even Bond doesn't have quite as much of a beating heart as this guy does. So that's a characterization that I found interesting. And of course, when we start this book, we also have to make up for, why aren't you dead?
There's that little bit of housekeeping needs to be done.
And so we give the explanation that mentioned before. Doctor just happened to know it. And of course, the French agent who was meeting him at the hotel was Mathis. It was nice to see him again. Mm-hmm. So turns out that Mathis saved his life. Then the doctor made sure to keep it saved because he knew about Japanese fish poisoning. And then but M's not sure, because he's like, okay, Bond, you just proved you were a screw-up. And I'm thinking, and this was your first clue? Because in every one of the books, Bond screws up.
Yep.
And royally screws up.
Yep. That's one of the consistent features of the books that we don't really see in the movies, is that, Bond is a much more human character in the books, I think.
He's not just much more human. I would think he actually falls to the side of being not necessarily that great at his job every day. I mean, like in a world where he's supposed to be the best of the elite, that doesn't say a whole lot for the elite. Now, granted, Ian Fleming writes from experience, so let's give ourselves pause when we try and digest that into real life. Let's not. Let's just keep treating this as fiction. So he's like, okay, I'm going to give you the softest assignment I can think of. I'm going to send you off to Jamaica because we just had one of our agents disappear. And in this book, they fully believe that Strangways ran off with his secretary, and that was it. And Bond tries to rationalize that for a while, but can't bring himself to do it because M doesn't think he's sending him down there for anything consequential. He thinks that this is just going to be busy work.
Yeah.
But of course, we find out that Strangways did not run off with his secretary, and he was killed because he dared trespass on Dr. No's land. Nobody knew, by the way, that Dr. No was doing anything wrong. So this is one where Bond stumbles onto the plot.
Yep.
And it's not one where he has an open pit nuclear reactor, because we always have to mention the open pit nuclear reactor because they're fun. It's one where he is toppling rockets, but they're not moonshots or test moonshots. It's just a missile test range.
Mm-hmm.
And, of course, he's being financed by Smersh, because everything has to be financed by Smersh.
Well,
there's nothing that can happen in a Fleming book that is not financed by Smersh. Are you kidding?
Well, the good stuff isn't. Just the bad stuff is all financed by Smersh.
I mean, I think we've had one so far, other than the Spectre novels, and even then they mention we have some ex-Smersh people in there.
Right.
So what he's doing is he's basically targeting a missile test range and making missiles, that are being test fired just crash into the ocean. And he figures that when he's ready to leave Crab Key, then he'll expect the Russians to pay him off and he'll send a missile into Florida. And, of course, he picks Miami, not Panama City or anything like that, where it'd be urban renewal. No, didn't mean that. We wouldn't actually advocate anything like that. But so it's not the open pit nuclear reactor where we're toppling space rockets. It's the just regular radio dish where we're toppling missiles. So it's not an unrealistic plot, amazingly enough. I actually bought into it. It makes sense. How about you?
Yeah, absolutely. This is one of the ones that I felt did have not a completely plausible plot, at least a much more plausible plot than some of the other things we've seen, and definitely more plausible in the book than in the movie of the same name. You have basically, you have rockets, but they're missiles. They're not spaceships. They're not, anything to do with satellites and laser beams or anything like that. It's just a bomb attached to a missile. That's all it is. And you really see, I think the biggest leap of anything is the quote-unquote dragon, and that was something I didn't really particularly like in the movie either, was the fact that, okay, yes, you've got an armored vehicle with a flamethrower attached to it. Anybody who looks at it sees an armored vehicle with a flamethrower attached to it. They don't see a dragon. This is dumb.
That's again, I think, Fleming's British imperial superiority, just assuming everyone else is a savage, and that even if you're white, if you're born in Jamaica, then you're stupid. Unless your name is Quarrel.
Yeah.
And even then, we have to make you superstitious, but we're going to forgive you because you're surrounded by superstitious idiots.
There you go.
And it's like, come on, really? It never flew with me either. It's the same thing where in Live and Let Die, all Negroes happen to follow the voodoo religion everywhere.
Every single one of them, everywhere. It's a true story.
And it's just like, it's just ridiculous stereotyping. And that's the part that fell short. But when you get to the meat and bones of what the plot is and what Dr. No is doing, that makes sense. But yeah, the dragon just is dumb. And of course,
it's a cool idea as a defense mechanism to have an armored vehicle with flamethrowers attached and things like that. But that's scary enough. Just be like, hey, don't go on that island. They've got a frickin' tank with flamethrowers on it. Don't mess around with that. No, they had to make the whole thing, oh, they've got a dragon over there. It's just call it what it is. It's still scary. It's still something that's going to burn you to a crisp, as Quarrel found out. But it's scary enough without having the superstition thrown behind it and assigned to everybody. Like, everybody automatically believes this. But other than that, I thought the majority of the plot of the evil plot of this book was very plausible.
Yeah, I agree. And I also found it interesting how you had the whole reason that things started going bad for Dr. No is because there was an endangered bird on his island. One of the birds that was responsible for all this guano. And the Sierra Club decided to try and muscle in on his action. And they decided to set up an observation post. And, of course, he brought out the dragon to kill them. And that was what Strangways was investigating. And M wanted to dismiss it even. It's like, oh, these old ladies and their damn birds. So, yeah, you can tell
those dang environmentalists always getting in big business's business.
Yeah, so you can tell that where Ian Fleming would probably be sitting on the climate change issue. even though he probably let out enough smoke to, well, anyway. So that was also kind of, I admit I laughed at that part where they're talking about the old ladies and their damn birds. It just read as so ridiculous and funny the way it was, just the way it was delivered, I thought was great. And then we have the character, of course, of Honey Rider. I had no trouble putting Ursula Andress back into this role. It's not hard. And once again, we have the standard Ian Fleming profile. She's damaged goods. And why is she damaged goods? Because, like every woman in Ian Fleming's literary experience, she's been raped. And, of course, we find out that she did get her revenge. A week later, she sent the Black Widow spider and killed the guy with it. So that part, which made it into the movie, if you remember correctly, was also in the book, except much more extreme. But it's just really, do you have to do this every time, Ian? And it's not like he's being forward or anything, because we know, unfortunately, that every single person who listens to this, whether they realize it consciously or not, knows at least one rape victim, probably more. I mean, it's a disgusting epidemic. But in terms of Fleming's characters, every woman has had this happen to them. Every single frickin' one. Really, dude? Do you have to keep doing this?
It's another thing that makes you wonder, is this something from his real life that's leaking into the pages of the book? Does he know an inordinate number of women who have been raped, or is there something else, even more sinister going on than that? I don't want to speculate.
I would lean more towards, does he know an inordinate number of rapists?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And I would be willing to bet that that's the correct answer. Just based on the attitudes overall throughout, and especially from his male characters who consider it an entitlement, I'm leaning in that direction myself, in terms of, I think that's where it comes from. Can't prove it, but that's just the feeling I get when I'm reading this.
Yeah.
So we have, of course, Honey Rider, who former rape victim, and now, of course, plays as quote-unquote damaged goods, so Bond feels sorry for her and like he has to fix her and save her. And from the attack, she also got a broken nose. So what does he want to do? He wants to pay for her plastic surgery for her. Isn't he a sweetheart?
Aw, so sweet.
And she's got this Dr. Dolittle thing going where she can talk to the animals, which is kind of interesting. Of course, that means that the natives think that she is an Obeah woman, which is a voodoo priestess, basically. So what other observations did you have about this book?
Besides the major changes in plot points, I felt that I think the movie did do a fairly good job of trapping I want to say, like, the spirit of the book, without obviously, capturing it exactly. But all in all, again, it was a very enjoyable book to read. I do agree with you that For Marshall with Love was better, but this was definitely one of the better ones, I think, of what we've read so far and talked about. I really did enjoy reading the book and, get past the plot holes that we discussed already, and it ends up being a really good story, and as we said, much more plausible than the extreme version that they created of the plot for the movie. All in all, I think it's a good, solid book, and I would definitely recommend it as another one to read. I would definitely not tell people not to read it.
And the character of Dr. No himself is a little bit more menacing, a little bit less of a gentleman than Joseph Wiseman portrayed him as. Mm-hmm. He doesn't have the thick glove artificial hands. Instead, he has claws, right. Much more reminiscent of Teehee. And he also has very thick contacts in front of his eyes, so he can take the metal claw and bang his eye with it to freak people out. He's also a bit more of a pervert. I mean, when Bond and Honey are unconscious after drinking their spiked coffee, he checks Honey out and is considering feeling her up with his claw, and then decides against it. But really,
how would that even? I mean, I'm trying to understand how that would even work, because you can't feel anything through the claw.
Yeah, that's the part that really made me kind of do a double take, because. Okay, if he was a standard villain, okay, fine. I'll actually accept that as standard conceit, but it just seemed out of place, like he was trying too hard. Now, I did find it really interesting with the obstacle course of death that he has James Bond run. That was kind of neat. That actually I thought played better than just James Bond going into a man-sized duct and crawling out of his cell so that he can end up by the open pit nuclear reactor.
Right, yeah,
So
it definitely did make more sense, and it was probably the most villainous part of the whole thing, because his actual plot wasn't so convoluted as some of the other villains, especially in the movies. But that part of it, the fact that he had essentially a torture maze for Bond to have to go through, gave him that twist that Bond villains need to really topple over that ledge of, I'm just a little crazy. No, I'm full-blown wacky insane.
Yeah, I really liked how that turned, and it's like, okay, so he's got to go through the intense heat, intense cold, he's got to go through spiders, there's a giant squid, I mean, there's some interesting stuff in there. And then, of course, the whole time he's thinking that honey is being eaten by crabs. And she gets the last laugh, she's like, I know all about these crabs because of her Dr. Dolittle power. All you do is you sit still, and they don't bother you at all. They're herbivores. But so I thought that the torture maze was the most exciting part about the book in terms of it. It really, really grabbed my attention.
Yeah, it was a fun part of the book, and I've always been a fan of the twisted villain, like the Saw type, was it Jigsaw, whatever, and things like that, where the villain makes you go through some serious twisted stuff before you can get out or before he kills you. So it was a very welcome twist.
And I also like how Dr. No meets his end, which you could not have done in the movie. Being buried under a pile of bird shit is just awesome.
Yes. If you're going to kill a bad guy, the one way you want to do it is completely buried in feces. That's a fantastic way to go.
Whereas Bond closing out the book by agreeing to be Honey's sex slave for the weekend is just, okay, whatever.
That was a little, yeah. It's like, okay, we've passed through. You're obviously done telling your story, so now you've decided to include a little bit of your fantasy in there as well in the actual book, and that maybe wasn't completely necessary. But it is. What it is.
It's not that it wasn't necessary. I mean, it wasn't, but I mean, it's not that it wasn't unwelcome. It's just that the way it plays out, it's like it just feels like tacked on, whatever. But overall, not a bad book. I thought it was a good adventure. I think it's actually a pretty decent tandem to read with From Russia with Love. Of course, read them in order. I would definitely recommend both of those books. Again, and it's also interesting. One more note. Every Chinese person works for Dr. No. It's just how it goes. That's just the way it is. He's very clear about that. So whatever Chinese person you meet works for Dr. No.
Oh, you're Asian. Then I guess you work for Dr. No. It's like, I don't know who Dr. No is. You work for him. You may not know it yet, but you work for him. So I'm going to have to kill you. Oh.
Anything else about Dr. No?
No, I think that about covers it. Definitely read it. Read From Russia with Love first, and then read this one. Have a good time.
All right. And that brings us to the portion of our program where we get into Pussy Galore. Even though Pussy Galore does not show up until the final, barely final 20% of the book at all, if that, maybe final 15%.
Is this where we finally get to die from the crab? Oh, no.
No, but we do get to finally meet Pussy Galore. And it's good to meet Pussy Galore because it's fun to say Pussy Galore.
It sure is. Pussy Galore is a fantastic character, most likely because her name Pussy Galore is, well, Pussy Galore. So, continue.
All right, now that we've gotten our inner 12-year-olds out of the way.
Yeah, speak for yourself. Just kidding. Yeah, so Goldfinger.
I will. Yes, we're going to be talking about Goldfinger. No, but I do actually want to start with the character of Pussy Galore, just because if we've been killing her name to death, we might as well keep going. The fact that he named her that was actually a really brilliant move on his part, because let's face it, we all want to say it. And even in the uptight era in which this was written, it's still, even if you weren't going to say it out loud, you wanted to read about it and you wanted to snicker in your head.
You're like, no, he said it again.
It's one of those, it stands out. It really stands out to the point where she becomes much more of a significant, larger character in your head than she actually is in the book. She's barely significant in the book in terms of how much she really drives for most of the story. She, like I said, she only shows up at near the very end. And yes, she's pivotal at that point, but through most of the book, she's not even there.
Right.
But what name do you remember after Goldfinger?
Pussy Galore.
Even before Goldfinger, for that matter, it's Pussy Galore. So in that, I think Fleming was incredibly smart. Now, in terms of her character, she is completely different than what we saw in the movie, and I think that's a good thing on the movie's part to have changed. In this book, she is not Goldfinger's personal pilot. No, she's just yet another one of the many hoods that Goldfinger brought together when he was giving his monologue about, being the pioneer of the greatest criminal heist in history. We'll get to that point later, but just start by knowing she's one of the hoods.
Right.
And specifically, she is the head of a criminal gang. Now, there's some odd juxtaposition here. A Harlem criminal gang. Now, we've already had Fleming establish Harlem, haven't we? As the haven of black crime everywhere. But apparently, after Mr. Big kicked the bucket, because Bond killed him in Live and Let Die, it was taken over by a gang of white lesbians called the Spent Mixers.
Forgot about that. Okay.
Now, the name of this gang, I mean, as soon as you throw in what is supposed to be their defining characteristic, that they're lesbians, I mean, okay, inner 12-year-old back in action. And I think this is Ian Fleming's inner 12-year-old as well. But the thing that bothered, and I don't care that, okay, we have a lesbian criminal gang and Pussy Galore is a lesbian, that's fine, I don't care. What bothers me is where that characterization is taken. Because we find out, once again, because Ian Fleming wrote a female character, why is Pussy Galore a lesbian? It's not because it's her preference. Of course it's not. Why isn't it her preference? Because if it was, she'd be an ugly hag. But no, she's actually attractive. This, of course, means that she must have been raped as a child. And guess what? She was raped a child by her uncle. So that is why she doesn't like men until she meets Bond. Bond is a real man. And she'll turn for Bond. Okay, bullshit.
It once again shows Fleming's lack of knowledge when it comes to how any of that stuff actually works. And it's not just Fleming. I mean, it is kind of a sign of the times, because at that time, a lot of people did think that it was some sort of disease that you could be cured of, or that it was a choice that you could just make. You just wake up one day and be like, today I'm going to be a lesbian. Tomorrow, we'll see. It doesn't work that way.
It really doesn't. And unfortunately, it's not just a sign of those times. Like, one comment that we did get on our site, which I did not respond to. It's the only comment really that was directed at us that one or the other of us has not, at least I haven't. I don't remember you responding to it, and I consciously refused to respond to it because I would have gotten ugly, and I didn't want to do that. I
might have just blocked it or deleted it if it was bad, depending on what it was.
No, it wasn't bad in terms of using offensive language. It was just the idea was so offensive to me. And that was when we talked about the movie, I had mentioned this aspect of the character in the book as well. It's like, well, that's just showing that Bond is a real man, and that's all there is to it. It's like, no. If you honestly think that, then you don't know any gay people.
Right.
Or at least you think you don't, because you probably do. But you think you don't, because you don't get it. It's a way you're wired. If there's somebody who can switch off between, well, I'm going to sleep with women today, I'm going to sleep with men tomorrow, they call that bisexual. There are people like that too, by the way, that's fine. And they are not necessarily the products of rape or anything like that. That's just how they're wired. And if you say, well, what about prison rape? That's different. That's all about power. That's not about sexual attraction. Take some psychology, folks. It'll do you some good. But it's just the idea that, well, Bond is such a man, he can turn anyone. If you think that, if you honestly believe that, then by all means, be my guest, go to a David Bowie concert, and then drop your pants. Because you just said, well, anybody can turn anybody. That means that obviously you can be turned by the right man too. Because women don't say this usually. It's only men who say this. I'm generalizing now, but it's a pretty good generalization. It's like, if you honestly believe that Bond could turn a dedicated lesbian because he's such a man, then you're saying you could be turned by the right man yourself. So go to a David Bowie concert, or when Freddie was around, go see Freddie and drop trow, because you just said you would. All I'm saying. Just a ridiculous concept. It was then, it is now.
Right. And I think I was taking a look real quick at the comments, because I was like, I don't remember anything being like jumping out at me that bad. And looking at it again, honestly, I think it was more of I think he was speaking towards what he thinks Fleming was trying to say, as opposed to his personal view Which is why I think I did respond to it, and I, kind of laughed it off as like, well, that's Fleming for you, more than anything, because it was, I think he was saying that the idea that Fleming was trying to portray is that Bond is just that irresistible, as opposed to all lesbians would be hetero if they had a man to do the job for them. That's what he said. He's leaning towards Fleming's thought of that, and so I personally took that to mean that particular listener was thinking that was saying that's what he thinks Fleming was thinking, not him himself was thinking that, which hopefully is the case.
That's why I did not put a written response, and that because I knew where I would end up going with it, and just because I have so many friends who are gay and bisexual that it ends up being a sore spot for me. I'm not myself, and I don't think I could turn for Bowie. If I could, my sex life would be so much better than it has been.
Bowie wouldn't do it for me either. I've never found him that attractive, but I don't know. Maybe I need my guys to be more masculine. Maybe he's a little too feminine for me, to turn me. I don't know. But no, I completely agree. I always hear people say that, like, oh, it's a choice. I'm like, okay, well then, do you remember the day you chose to be straight? Or how about this? Just tomorrow, choose to not be straight. Do that. No, you can't. Well, that's because it's not a choice, idiot. It's it's the way you are. It is you. It is part of you, and just accept that and learn to move on. Like, why is it such a big deal? That's what gets me, is why it's still such a big deal. And hopefully, as I said before earlier, we are progressing towards a place where it's not as big a deal anymore. But it's slow going, and the people who would choose to fight that type of equality are getting more and more vocal as they're getting pushed out of more and more places. So I take that as a good sign. The fact that they're getting vocal is because they're no longer winning. When they were winning, they didn't have to be loud about it.
I will agree with that, and maybe at some point we'll be able to eat chicken of non-hate.
I know, that would be so great, because, man, I love that chicken, but I won't eat it. I won't buy it, actually. If somebody else buys it and I didn't have any part in the choice, I'll still eat it. I mean, it's already been bought and paid for. Why am I going to turn it down? But, I won't actually give them my money.
And, of course, we have also in the book Miss Masterson. Well, we have both Miss Mastersons in this book. We have the first Miss Masterson, who... Let's get back to Masterson, actually. Well, I'm just trying to think. There's so many tangents and ways you can go with this book. Now, you said your overall impression of this book is you enjoyed the book.
I did enjoy the book for the most part. There were some definite times when I feel like I may have inadvertently skimmed because it was just so much explanation. Like, usually Fleming doesn't get trapped in that I'm going to take 15 pages to describe something small. But during the golf game, holy jeez, like, seriously? Did not have to be that long.
So boring.
It was so long. I'm like, okay, I get it. They're playing golf. I've seen the movie. I know how this ends. Like, it did not need to be I think he described every hole of the game. It's like, oh, I can't take this.
And it's not like when he describes a card game, because we've discussed when he discusses a card game, it's interesting.
Yes, and well, also because when he does a card game, he usually describes maybe 3 or 4 specific hands, and they're always different and interesting.
And he plays them out as action scenes.
Right.
Whereas this golf game, I mean, if you've ever heard George Carlin's description of what golf is, that's exactly what he makes it sound like.
Is he the one that said it's
flies having sex?
Oh. I thought it was who was it that said it's a good walk interrupted or something like that?
A good walk spoiled. That was actually a professional golfer.
No.
No, George Carlin described it as flies having sex. That's how interesting it is to watch. It's just, the golf scene is interminable. It is boring. It is awful. I wanted to skim it, but because I'm dedicated to my audience, I did not. I read the whole thing. I'm sorry I did, but I did.
It was.
And I've read it more than once now.
I'm pretty sure I did read the entire thing as well, but I caught myself skimming, because I don't like to skim when I'm reading any book. And usually when I find myself skimming, I realize that, hey, maybe this isn't a book I need to read, and I put it down. But because I was reading this for this, obviously, I was like, nope, I've got to finish this. And so I went back. And so I think that scene was made even worse for me, because I did catch myself skimming at one point and went back to the beginning and started to reread that whole scene. And so I think there are parts of it that I actually read through twice, making it even longer and more boring. So if you are reading the book and you just want the story, trust us, you can skim through the golf scene. You're not going to lose much.
What about now, beyond the golf scene, I admit overall, and it's not just because of the boring golf scene and not just because of what I find to be the offensive portrayal of Pussy Galore, I I don't like this book very much. And part of it, along with those two things, is I think it's lazy. I think this is one of Fleming's laziest books. Because honestly, look at the framework of this book. He's rewriting Moonraker, is what he's doing. We start with James Bond being called in as a favor to stop a card cheat. Exactly the same, no different. And that's, again, except now he's catching Goldfinger cheating at canasta, which tells you that this book was written in the 50s, by the way. The one decade in which this was a really popular card game.
I used to play canasta with my mom.
Playing online now.
I used to play canasta with my mom back in the day. But yeah, it wasn't something that I would choose to bust out like, hey, I could go for a rousing game of canasta right now.
So he catches Goldfinger cheating at canasta, and it's done the same way as it is in the movie.
Right.
And so, okay, we meet the guy who we think is going to have no, except in the case of the book, just like in Moonraker, he doesn't expect ever to run into him again. But then later on he finds out, we have a mission, and it happens to involve the guy you just caught cheating at cards.
What?
And what's this mission to do? It's to blow up it's to, do some massive damage to someplace important. It's like, I felt like he was recycling the plot of Moonraker. And what does he have to do? Again, he has to try and get in good with him, just like I have to try and get in good with Drax, figure out how things are going. It didn't sit well in terms of, and it's not that I minded that he recycled the plot, because obviously I didn't care that View to a Kill was Goldfinger in terms of movies, and Spy Who Loved Me and Moonraker are the same movie. I don't mind those things. It's that it felt lazy the way it was written. And the way it was written the first time around in the book for Moonraker, I thought was so much better. That's one thing that bothers.
I can definitely agree with that. I can definitely say that Moonraker was the better book. Like I said, I do agree that of these three, Goldfinger is definitely the worst. However, it didn't bug me that much when I was reading it. I still enjoyed the read, with the exception of the golf scene. I still enjoyed the actual read. So it wasn't until kind of after the fact when, yes, the card cheating thing did strike me as like a major recycled point right from the very beginning, but it didn't carry over. It didn't flavor the rest of the book for me. So I was still able to enjoy it, although I will qualify that as this is definitely not the first book I would recommend to somebody to read. If they're looking at, hey, I want to read a Bond book. Should I read Goldfinger first? No, don't do that. And definitely of these three that we're talking about today, it's definitely not the highlight of these three either. I agree with your assessment. From Russia with Love was the better, Dr. No's second, and this one's third, and a fairly distant third compared to the other two. But even with all that said, I did enjoy reading it.
I was okay with reading it. I mean, it wasn't one that, if it weren't for this, I would have put it down. But it's just, I remembered why, after reading it this time, when I read it the first time, I didn't particularly like it very much. I found it just dull, basically. I didn't feel that sense of adventure that I feel in most of the Ian Fleming books, where the adventure carries you through even the stuff that culturally you don't like, or through the stuff where the characters aren't necessarily as deep as you feel they should be, because Fleming usually imparts that sense of adventure, and I just did not feel that in this book ever. It just felt like he's coasting after hitting one out of the park and then getting another one where he was really into a groove. This one, he just felt like he was coasting and not trying. That was my take. And then you throw in so much else that just doesn't work. Along with Pussy Galore, we now also have the character of Oddjob. Now, Oddjob himself is interesting, but we now have Ian Fleming's racist voice breaking through to James Bond, and Bond himself is doing it. Mm-hmm. Because in this book, we have Bond flat out saying that Koreans are evolutionarily inferior and should be classified as apes.
Yeah, I had forgotten about that. I think I purposely blocked it from my mind. Yeah, that was awful.
It's just like, damn, you realize you're going to have a child with a Japanese woman who is going to be very similar genetically to... Never mind. It's just... Damn, that one came down out of all of Ian Fleming's racism through all of his books, and there's a ton to pick from. That line where Bond actually flat out calls Koreans apes, that struck me harder than any of them he's ever used, in terms of, damn, dude, that wasn't even cool in the 50s.
Yeah, that was a little rough, and like I said, I had almost forgotten about it just because I think I blocked it from my memory. It's one of those things as soon as I read it, I was like, oh, And then just like, okay, we're gonna forget that happened.
You want to forget that he makes that Goldfinger has Oddjob eat a cat. Really, dude?
See, I'm okay with that because I'm not a cat fan. So I'm like, if it was a dog, I'd be like, hey, you knock it off right now. None of this dog eating stuff. But
people, fine. People can deserve it. Animals, no. Not house pets. Leave the house pets alone.
Yeah, it was a little rough. And Oddjob was not nearly as cool in the book as I felt he was in the movie.
You don't have Harold Cicada.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The movie
Cicada
Oddjob was
really
fun. The book one was just kind of meh.
Yeah, Cicada really makes that character. And Goldfinger himself is more menacing in this book. He's not good guy Goldfinger. I mean, yes, he does end up killing hoods, but it doesn't feel like he's being good guy Goldfinger anymore. And the plot is, it actually goes to the stupid place that the movie was smart enough not to go. Because as James Bond points out in the movie, okay, Goldfinger, so you're going to break into Fort Knox. So you're going to have very little time to load as much gold as you can onto the trucks, and it's going to take huge convoys and stuff.
Right.
And you're going to have about an hour before the Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marines force you to put it all back. And Goldfinger in the movie says, I know, I'm not going to steal it. I'm going to irradiate it so it's useless to everybody. That is actually smart. In the book, nope, he's going to steal it.
Yeah.
And not only is he going to steal it, and have the Hood steal it too, they're going to take large convoys of trucks, which they figure they're going to somehow surreptitiously sneak away with. But Goldfinger is going to take a train. A train. Now, yes, this is faster, but it can only go one place. It can only go where the rails go. This is much easier to find than even the convoy of trucks.
Exactly.
And where's he going to take it? He's going to take it to a port where a Soviet ship is docked. Because, of course, Goldfinger is the head accountant of SMERSH.
But of course.
Of
course we had to work SMERSH in there somewhere.
And this is another thing that knocks it down for me, because the gold theft plot is stupid on its face.
Yes.
And then throwing him in as the head accountant of SMERSH, what was the point? I just don't see it. I just don't at all.
Yeah, that was definitely a blatant attempt just to tie it back in to be like, oh yeah, by the way, SMERSH. Okay, we're done with that now. Let me tell the rest of my story. And yes, the movie did such a better job because it realized how stupid the actual evil plot was. To steal all this gold, you would need, like you said, so many trucks, and you'd need to get away and not be found, and somehow, and yeah, his plan for that was to essentially kill everybody in a whatever mile radius of the place, which would definitely delay his capture because they would be a little bit more worried about all the dead people than finding the gold right away. But ultimately, there's no way you can think that he's actually going to get away with it, especially taking a train to a Russian ship or, just all these trucks. The movie, when they made it, they must have realized, they must have looked at that and said, no, this is dumb. So how can we make it a little less dumb? and they did a fantastic job. So
I think the movie did a much better job of it. And then we have the matter of the ladies Masterson. We have our first Masterson, who, as in the movie, is the one who's looking through binoculars and telling Goldfinger exactly how to cheat the cards. Of course, at Canasta this time. But in the book, it's not okay, Bond sleeps with her, and then he gets knocked out, and then he wakes up to find her painted with gold. Nope, that's not how it works. Nope, she gets away with it. And Bond says, I'm taking her with me on a train to New York. And they go on the train, and they have lots of sex on the train. And then he gives her the money he was paid to catch Goldfinger cheating at cards, and she says, I'm going to go back. And so the iconic scene with the gold body painting never happens on camera.
Nope.
We only find out about it later when her sister says that, in fact, she was later found dead, painted in this manner. And the reason that she was painted in this manner, and of course they do the since scientifically disproven skin to breathe thing, was because what Goldfinger, being a pervert, would do was that once a month he would hire hookers and paint them gold and have sex with them so he could feel like he was having sex with gold. Ew.
At least it is one of the softer metals, right? Yeah, it's just weird. And again, the whole painting thing, no, covering yourself in paint will not kill you. You don't have to leave a small space open at the base of the spine for the skin to breathe. It just doesn't work that way, and they've proven that. But at the time that he wrote that, and even at the time of filming the movie, they didn't really know that. So it's something that at least taste fits, but I think, again, the movie did it so much better in actually showing us it.
Well, yeah, the movie put it on camera. In fact, the cover of the edition of the book that I have still plays off of that scene from the movie, even though it does not occur in the book, of Bond seeing the painted girl. So it's on the book cover. It's not in the book. In the book, it's just mentioned as an afterthought, and Bond never sees it.
Right.
The sister, meanwhile, instead of getting killed right away when Bond catches her trying to kill Goldfinger at the factory, is allowed to live along with Bond, who, of course, does not almost get his balls cut off with a laser, but instead with a buzzsaw, because lasers aren't really a thing yet. The laser was much cooler. Again, we're finding that the movie's much better than the book here.
Yes. Well, and for the lasers, to buzzsaw translation, I can understand that because, like you said, when the movie was written, or when the book was written, I should say, lasers probably weren't that big a thing and not as well known, so it would have been kind of like, what is he talking about? Whereas in the movie, by the time they made the movie, we had already seen, some lasers and stuff, and we're like, that's cool.
And the movie was actually the first use of a realistic laser in a movie ever. So after that, we find that Sister gets to live, but she's not interested in Bond at all. Not because she's not interested in the person who she thinks got her sister killed. No, it's because she's a lesbian. And as soon as she meets Pussy Galore, she falls head over heels, and all she wants to do is follow Pussy around. She just wants to chase Pussy. That's all she does. And that's what gets her killed, is chasing Pussy.
I'm pretty sure that's what's going to end up on Bond's headstone as well. Wow. It's so, thank you, Ian Fleming, for writing that character as that name, because, wow, it satisfies my inner 12-year-old so much to be able to talk about it and be like, no, I'm not saying anything dirty. That's the character's name, for crying out loud. I'm just saying the character's name.
But that is how it turns out, because the moment Pussy Galore shows up, suddenly Masterson is like, and ceases to be anything but somebody who chases Pussy. That's all she does. So, and the way I do find it interesting. I'm going to say some good things about the book, really. Specifically, I found it fascinating how Goldfinger decided to use them as secretaries for his meeting of hoods to try and then plan out the attack on Fort Knox. And also Bond is one of the ones who has to help develop strategy. So I thought that part was cool. But overall, I just didn't find it an exciting book. I didn't think it was particularly well written. I thought the stereotypes got really bad, and I thought it was lazy. So to me, honestly, Goldfinger is one of the worst books in the entire series. It's not the worst book, if I remember correctly. There's 2 more I have to read to be sure of. But this is not one that I would put high on my list of recommendations, people.
I could definitely agree with that. It's definitely not his strongest effort. Even out of these 3 we've already discussed, it falls a far third place. I have a tough time saying one of the worst, but I'm sure I'm sure eventually we will actually go through and rank all the books. I'm having a feeling that this will end up in the bottom third, definitely bottom half, possibly bottom third, possibly lower than that. But again, we do still have some more to go through before we can get to that point. But I wouldn't, like I said, I would definitely not recommend this as the first Bond book for somebody to read. Not even the second, probably not even the third. But I would recommend reading it if you're going to read the series, and even if you're just, this one does not have to be read in order with Dr. No. I don't even believe it has to be read in order with the next book either, but I wouldn't recommend it as a first, but I would still say it was an enjoyable read. Skim through the Gulf, but the rest of it, I did enjoy the read, even though there were some moments that were cringeworthy and other moments that were just straight out, what? But I enjoyed reading it. Not as much as some of the others, but I did.
And this is why we have 2 hosts. And that's cool. That is, I'm sincere whenever I point that out, that way everybody's got their own perspective. Like to me, this was one of the weakest books in the series. And if it weren't for the fact that we were doing this show, it's not one I probably would ever have read again. Mm-hmm. And I doubt that I will read it again now after this. It'll enjoy a place on my shelf as part of my collection, but I don't think I'll read it again. So any other final thoughts on any of our books?
No, I think we've kind of summed it up. Of the 3, From Russia with Love is definitely the winner of the 3, with Dr. No coming in a close second. and Goldfinger dragging up the rear. But I would recommend all three to read. I would read them in order, although Goldfinger you could take or leave as far as if you don't want to give it a shot, that's fine. Just read the other two. Or if you want to read the From Russia with Love and Dr. No and maybe jump to the Spectre series and then, hit up Goldfinger later on down the road, that's fine too. But definitely read From Russia with Love and Dr. No. I highly recommend both of those.
Indeed. And that's going to do it for our episode on the Middle Fleming novels. We hope you enjoyed it and hoped you didn't mind all of our tangents. And we will see you next time on Her Majesty's Secret Podcast, which, regardless of which side of the pond you live on, is going to be on 7/7. Yes, it will be July 7th, so a great 007 day, which we will be.
I was going to say, if you really want to get into the numerology of it, it's on 7/7, and it's 2014. If you take the 14 divided by the 2, that's 7 again. Oh, I hate numerology, but because you can make it do anything you want.
But still 7/7 for 007, so we're going to have a special episode for that, and we will be discussing megalomania. Yes. In May, we talked about the villains and the henchmen. This time, on 7/7, we will be discussing the villainous plots that were come up with by all of the villains. We will also be doing a little bit of a discussion about some of the great speeches wherein they tell all, and one more extra specialist just for Eric. Yay. We'll let you figure that out come time for the show.
It's all chickens.
But in the meantime, I am Ziggy Berkeley.
And I'm Eric Dewey.
And you have been listening to Her Majesty's Secret Podcast, only on The Fern.
This has been another great presentation by the 4-Eyed Radio Network. You can find more information at 4eyedradio.com.